up until this point, we've covered SOPs, VOPs, and CHOPs. And now in this lesson, we're going to cover COPs, which is compositing operators. Compositing operators can do, we can do all sorts of stuff with compositing operators. We could bring in our image sequences and perform, we could do keying, compositing, adding depth of field, working with our passes, cleaning up noise, stuff like that. We could use it to do, to generate motion vectors and generate motion blur that we could be using as velocity fields in our simulations. We can be doing all sorts of stuff with COPs. It's like an almost completely separate program within Houdini that behaves very much like Houdini and remains completely integrated with Houdini. It's very powerful. In this example, what I want to do is just open your eyes to the power of COPs by doing a little we're kind of going to use it the way we would use Substance Designer or something like that. We're going to have a live linked procedural texture that is going to be an animated displacement texture that we can use in Redshift. You could actually use this texture in Mantra too if you wanted to, but we're going to stick with Redshift because it's fast and it is a growing standard in our industry. So let's start off by creating a let's start off by looking at where our COP network is. Now in this lesson, I'm going to just pop off this I'm popping open this left side tree view by just grabbing this very furthest edge over here and just hitting my mouse button to drag it out, and then I'm just going to bring this back a little bit here. So we've dealt with chop nets and all this stuff, but we're concerned with in our image context here this comp, this image network called comp1, and I'm gonna call this I could just rename this. I'll just call this my texture, so it makes sense up here. So in here we can create our own textures. So I'm gonna just to dive in to see what it initially looks like, I'll just throw it on a file. And the file by default has this butterfly on it. This is just loading some default Houdini image for us, but we can't see it really anywhere in our scene. It's because it doesn't exist in our scene view in the normal sense. It's over here in the composite view. So if I just click this tab to open up our composite view, you can see we have our butterfly. And I can do all sorts of stuff. I can blur the butterfly like so. Throw down a blur and crank that up, and our butterfly is blurred out. We can do we could do, we can mess with hue, bring this thing in, and edit hue curves. I've never even messed with this before, so I'm not even entirely sure how to play with a hue curve, but it looks like, yeah, I'm just clicking here and adding points, and I can't really tell if it's doing anything. Yeah, it looks like I'm just messing with basically saturation levels on various parts of this image. If I turn that blur off, you can see the effect of this on and off. It's very subtle, but it's changing things, so that's cool. Yeah, if I move that around, we could do other things like color correct. How about this? So color correct, I could add green to this, and if I throw this on display, you can see that it's, we're doing normal kind of Nuki After Effectsy type things to images in here. So one of the things that I think is super cool, I'm just going to delete all that out, is that you can actually create shapes and stuff from for example, we've got, let's see, if I throw down a shape, we could create a shape like this. We could either throw down a shape manually and just choose, ring or whatever kind of shape we want. It's got various rotation handles on it, etc. We could throw down a roto shape like this. Hit the display flag on there. That just makes it show up over here in our view. And I could just draw, any old shape like that and then say done. and it converts it into a Bezier for us that we could, manipulate. All this is stuff that is sort of built in, and you can combine this to do various tasks. So one of the things that I think is really cool about shapes is you can actually create a shape that's based off of geometry. So if I throw down I'll just come out here and create a torus like so. And then I'm just going to go back into my texture here, and we'll just create a geometry. And the geometry node wants to grab a SOP. So I'm just going to go into my object level and grab my torus and throw it in here into my SOP. You can see this little image appears that looks like kind of like a pill. And that's because if we look at our composite view, this composite view is taking the image view of this geometry as viewed down the z-axis. If I change that to the viewing it down the y-axis, now we have our torus shape. And if I jump back to our scene view and mess around with some of the parameters of this torus, it will change that image in our composite view. So I could jump into the torus and change the radius so that it's smaller. Go back to the composite view, and now this has been updated to reflect that, which is really cool. So let's just create something that we would want to use maybe as a procedural sort of texture, maybe an animated pattern that we could throw in there. So I have something in mind. Let's throw down a grid, and we'll make sort of a cool Voronoi cell pattern for ourselves. So I'm just going to scatter some points, and I got to switch back to the scene view over here so we can see our points. I'm going to use only 100 points. That should be fine. Something like that. And then I just want to kind of randomize their motion a little bit just so that they have a little bit of movement. If I just throw down a Voronoi right now and wire these guys in like so, you can see we've got our Voronoi cells. I'm just going to uncheck create interior surfaces so we don't get that kind of jittering. I'm also going to bring my grids, rows, and columns down to 2 so there aren't any extra divisions. You can see we've got our Voronoi pattern here, but it's not really doing anything. I kind of want to set it up so that these kind of wiggle around each other and kind of nudge each other out of the way and stuff like that. So I'm going to add a attribute noise to our scatter. So attribute noise. And we'll just throw that in right here. I'm just going to highlight it independently real quick. You can see attribute noise by default is adding noise to the CD attribute. So if I just go over here and bring up my point size, you can see all my points have these sort of pastel different colors. I actually want to not mess with the color, but mess with the position. So I'm just going to change the attribute that it's adding noise to. I'm going to change that to position. So it's using position as a location attribute, and then it's using position as the attribute that's being driven. So that's cool. Now you can see all the points have kind of jumped up in space a little bit. That is because this noise is not centered. So it's great because a lot of times when you're messing around with noises and VOPs, you gotta kind of remember what the ranges for the noises are. They're all kind of different. It takes a little getting used to. This just has a centered noise option. I just click that, and then it centers my noise for me automatically, which is super handy. The other thing I want to do is make it animated. So now when I click play, you can see my noise is bouncing around. It's going a little fast. I'm just going to, down here in the lower left-hand corner, click the real-time toggle so I can see that noise playing back in real time. And I just want to modify this so that it isn't quite so jittery. So I'm going to scroll down here to the pulse duration. I'm going to just increase the pulse duration a little bit. And maybe something like, somewhere around 5 works good. And then I'll let's increase the amplitude quite a bit so that these points have more distance that they're traveling. And I want the movement to be a little bit more smooth, so I'm actually going to come back down here, and under roughness, I'm just going to dial that roughness back a bit so that we get something more fluid-like so. And then I think the last thing is, it's noising up these points, and they're moving great in the X and Z and Y directions, but I just want them to move in the X and Z direction. I just want them roaming around on the ground. So I can get that to happen by coming up here to the amplitude and grabbing our Y component and setting it to 0. And that sticks all the points to the ground. It doesn't allow them to have any noise in Y, but it lets them kind of walk around on the ground aimlessly. So now if I wire this into our Voronoi pattern, we get these cool little cells that kind of walk around and avoid each other. Nice. So I want to, now I just want to make it so that these cells look a little bit more rounded off. So I'm just going to resample them. If I turn on point display, I'm just going to hit the D key, go to guides, and change my point marker size to be a little bit larger. We only have really straight edges between each point on these corners. If I throw down this resample, it adds more points for us, which is cool. So if I turn the points off, you can see that we get these little kind of pockets starting to form around the corners. So that's fun. That's, you know, having a resample put together like this allows us to do other things like smooth this geo. So I'm going to throw it on a smooth. And if I just wire this together like so and highlight it, it looks like nothing's happened. And I think that that's because the smooth is by default trying to constrain the boundary. It sees this as it sees these edges as hard edges, and it only is thinking it should be smoothing the geo inside of those unshared edges, but there is no geo. It's just one solid primitive. So I'm just going to select none for our constrained boundary, and now we start to get these we start to get more drastic curves because of the smoothing that's happening. So if I bring up this filter strength and maybe decrease the filter quality, you can see that it starts to make very drastic smoothing operations. So I can bring those down and get something like this. I can bring it up and get something a little bit more circular like that, which is cool. Nice. So I think that using something like this for our displacement would be kind of cool. I mean, we've created sort of a texture. And, you know, in another app, what we might do is we might just like take a camera, point it down from the top view like so, and just render it out, bring it into After Effects, do whatever we need to do with it, and then bring it back into another app and use it as a displacement texture. But the cool thing with this cop stuff is that we can actually just access this geometry on the fly. So let's just create a null to make it easier to reference. I'm going to call this cell pattern. And then I'm going to jump back over to my my texture. And for my geometry, I'm going to switch to composite view as well. For my geometry, I'm going to select my cell pattern that I just created over here. So I'm just going to drag that cell pattern into this area. You can see that it creates a matte image of that cell pattern. Now I'm just navigating around in here by holding my middle mouse button down or dragging in and out using my middle mouse button. So just a note about that. About the navigation in here, it's very similar to how it is everywhere else in Houdini. Same kind of functions apply over here in the network view. So now this is actually trying to make this image fit inside of a 1920 by 1080 image, which is probably the default of the project or whatnot, or the default for cops. I actually want to just create like a nice, let's just do a 2K image. So I'm just going to go manually override the size with 2048 by 2048. Now you can see that that image is sort of embedded in this square for us. So now that I have this image, I could do something like add a blur to it. I throw down a blur so that our edges that are displaced have sort of like a kind of a soft fall off to them. So I can do a little bit of that. Maybe I'll increase the size of that. Now I'm seeing like my cells look like they're a little bit too big, so I'm going to just hop back over to SOPs and modify that the cell size a little bit. So I'm just going to go back to my cell pattern here, and I'm just going to increase the smoothing to something a little bit larger. And you can see that that's updating our image accordingly. So cool. Now what I want to do is I'm going to just go back into the into our COP network, and I'm going to set my display flag to be on the bottom as well. This is the flag that will be exported when we reference this. So I want to also throw down a null just right now so that we can easily pull this into another section of Houdini. So I'm just going to throw down a null like this. I'm just going to wire that in. And now I'm going to call this texture out. And I'll set the display flag there as well. So now let's just apply a material. Let's apply this as a material to another object. So I'm going to just switch back to, I'm going to switch this back to my scene view, and let's go up a level. I'm going to hide the grid now and just throw down a sphere. Enter. And I'm going to go, let's just add a light to the sphere. While I'm up here, I'm going to go to my Redshift tab, and I'm going to control click on light. That creates a light based off of my camera view. And then I'm going to create a camera here. And maybe I'll just drag this up and frame that in a little bit. And then maybe I'll kind of back out and add another light right here. So I'll just control click to add another light right there. And on the sphere object, I don't have a material, so I can hop over to my matte context over here. And in here, I'm just going to throw down an RS material builder. For Redshift material builder, I'll call this my texture. And I'll just jump inside and create a Redshift material. RS material, and I'll wire that into the surface, and I'll jump back up to my texture, and I will drag it onto my sphere object. Now if I am in here, I'm just going to set my diffuse channel to like red or something like that, and just bring my reflection roughness up a little bit just to make sure it's working. I'm going to just add another tab up here for my Redshift render view, and I'm going to click render, and I've got a red sphere. Perfect. So my shader is being applied. That's great. I just want to go and do a little bit of work on the geometry. Let's see, my sphere object I created here. This sphere, I want to make I'm going to switch to the scene view. I want to make this sphere let's do a polygon, just a regular polygon, and I'll just increase the frequency. I seem to like that a little bit better. So if I go back, so now what I can do is I can go into this material, and let's actually, add a texture here. So if I wanted to add a texture to this surface, I could throw down a texture. Redshift texture like so, and put the out color in the diffuse channel, and look for a file name, from disk, and load a texture in. But how would I load in the material that we were creating in our CopNet? There isn't a file on disk for that. So there's a trick. We just go and here where I created a null, naming my null with all caps makes it hop to the top of any list that is appearing in Houdini. So it makes it really easy for me to grab up here. Now it's just under my texture. It's texture out. It's at the top. So I can just drag that over here into my file name. And now that that's in there, if I were to go over to the Redshift render view and click render again, it just renders black. It doesn't see that texture is there. And that's because we got to do just one little trick right here. At the beginning of the file name, we just have to type in op and then put in a colon. And that will allow it to read that texture out. So I'm just going to hit refresh, and it looks like nothing's happening. So I'm just going to go and make sure everything's cool inside of the COP network. So we've got our thing here. I think I know what the issue is. I think I forgot to add UVs to my sphere. So I'm just going to hop into my sphere and throw down a UV project. So I got the UV project. I'm going to do a polar projection, and let's click render one more time. And there you can see the texture is appearing on our sphere. Sweet. So now if I were to go back into the material that we're working on here, I could throw it on a displacement. Redshift displacement. And I could wire this into the texture map and then wire this out into the displacement channel. And nothing will happen because I got to go back over to my sphere object into the Redshift object tab and then the tessellation and displacement tab and enable tessellation, and then scroll down here and say enable displacement. You can see that the displacement kicks in and this gets blasted out in all sorts of directions. I just want to change the minimum edge length. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, 0.01, like so. And then I'm going to go back to the material or the displacement, and I'm going to just bring this displacement scale down a little bit, maybe 0.1. And it looks like it needs a little refresh. Oh, no, there it goes. It looks like it refreshed itself. That's cool. Awesome. I'm just going to dial this lighting back a little bit. I'm just going to hop back over to my Redshift Light 1, and let's turn this light shader down to maybe 10. Maybe not 0, but am I having an issue with my 1 key? There we go. 10. And let's bring this one shader to 10 as well. Yeah. Oh, this is what happens if my mouse is hovering over this Redshift window and I'm hitting numbers, it doesn't, and it sees that number as like possibly a keyboard shortcut. It does a hostile takeover and won't let me fill in my field. So now that my mouse is over the parameter view, I can type that in and we're all good. So here we are. We're getting our displacement. That's awesome. What else can we do? Let's maybe add a little bit of noise to this to like get this texture to look a little bit more interesting. I just want to check if I scrub through, is it animating? Does it move? So it's refreshing now. It should be refreshing. Yeah, and you can see that the texture is moving. So it's taking that geometry that we created out in SOPs. It's bringing that geometry into COPS. It's doing some blurring and stuff on it, and then it's sending it out to our Redshift shader, and then our Redshift shader is bringing it into Redshift and rendering it as displacement. It's pretty insane that this is all just happening internally, and we have the like power of a compositor feeding into our texture live. I mean, the fact that we haven't left Houdini and we were able to kind of make this round trip out into a compositing context and back into a final renderable texture is really kind of mind-blowing. So let's just mess around with this some more. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back into our COPS and see if we can, add maybe a little bit of noise to this and just make it a little bit more interesting. I'm also seeing like, yeah, it looks... Yeah, I just want to see what else we can do. So I'm going to stop the render here. Let's jump over to our composite view, and I'm also going to jump into the texture network that we're making over here. So let's add a noise. I'm just going to create a noise, and here is a here's a noise. I'm just going to highlight it. By default, it's doing the whole it's doing the 1920 by 1080 thing again. I'm just going to check the box to override the size. I'm going to go back to the geometry node on this image tab. I'm going to right click. I'm going to copy this parameter, go over here and paste relative reference. So whatever resolution I set my geometry at, the noise will follow suit. Now the noise is all sorts of colors. That's because by default it is working on all 3 components. So that's a noise per component or channel, the red, green, and blue channel. So I'm going to just uncheck that. So it's just doing one noise in general for the whole thing. Now we get these really dark areas. Now if I right click on here and choose inspect, you can see that this noise is 0 centered. So we get some values that go negative and some that go positive. I'm just going to try and rein that in a little bit with the levels. So I'm going to throw it on a levels. And if I hit the display flag on the levels, you can see here that my input levels, I can bring this level down below 0 to encapsulate the lower values of this noise to kind of bring them into the 0 to 1 range, which is cool. And you can also see a histogram here if you want. That's cool. And you even get little handles you can adjust various things. So I've got the input level set to -0.8. It seems to grab all the noise like so. So I've got my input level set here. The next thing I want to do is maybe modify this noise. It looks a little blobby right now, so let's just bring up the turbulence to maybe 5 and mess with the roughness a little bit. That looks cool. And maybe the spatial frequency. I don't know if I can bring that maybe down a little bit, something like that. And I could animate this noise if I wanted to. If I change the frame frequency to something like that and hit play, you can see it it's doing its own little evolving. Now, if I maybe bring this down to 0.01, does it do a little bit more drastically? Yeah, you can see it's a very gradual noise animation now. And yeah, maybe bring the roughness back just a slight amount. Let's see what this exponent does. Looks like this is just giving us a bias as to, how much of these newer, smaller patterns are appearing. I'm just going to go with this for right now. So I just want to add these two kind of components together. Now I think our blur, this geometry right here is ranging from basically 0 to all the way up to 1, and I want to give it some room so that when I add these two together, they don't really go above 1. So I'm going to go back to the geometry, and when you have this geometry node on this geometry tab, you can actually choose what color your geometry comes in at. So I can just bring this down to maybe 0.5, so we get a nice like 50% gray value. That way, when we add it with our levels over here, with our noise rather, that it isn't going to be all insanely blown out or anything like that. Even though Houdini's even though the displacement will read values over 1, I just like to be able to see still in the viewport. Anything over 1 just gets it gets too hot and your monitor won't actually display it. But if we kind of keep the levels controlled, we can see what the texture actually looks like and kind of envision it in our heads a little bit better. So let's just throw down a layer here. This layer node will actually allow us to kind of layer items on top of each other. So now when these are layered, because this channel, this shape has an alpha channel in the shape of these circles, we can actually see through it, through to the noise. If I hit Shift R and reverse these, it actually looks like we're actually bringing our geometry on top of this. So it looks like everything that goes into the left is on top, above things that are going into, looks like everything that is going into the right is actually being composited things that are going into the left. I find this a little bit confusing. If that's confusing for you as well, you could use the composite node. So I'm going to throw down a composite node as well, just so we can see what our options are for this kind of thing. So the foreground color, we can put in our blur. This is very explicit. We've got our foreground and our background, which is cool. So if I wire this together, we get the same result. We've got our foreground color is this gray blur that we have, and our background color are our levels. And if I go to this composite tab and I just dial back the foreground weight, you can see that it's basically just making our blurred out blobs just kind of disappear like in terms of opacity. And the background weight as well, I could just fade that in and out if I needed to. but right now we're just compositing one over the other. I want to add them together, so I can just select add here, and then you can see that these this noise pattern is popping through nicely on these colors, on these in the cell areas. We are getting some levels that are over 1. But if I just let them go, they don't seem like they're too far over 1, like so that it would create something unpredictable. So I think that if I just play this down a little bit, plays back. It's not super fast to play back. Once it kind of caches, there isn't really a visual way that I found that it kind of shows what your cache is the way it would, like the green bars do in After Effects or anything like that. There possibly is a way. Maybe I'll look into that. But you know, if you just play it back a little bit, it seems like it sort of ends up like caching them somewhere in memory. So now I'm just going to wire this into the texture out, since that's what's being referenced by our texture. So if I just hit that, and let's just jump back over to our render view and fire off another render. And you can see that that noise pattern has been added into our geo, which is cool. I want to just see. I want to go over to the output context. So I'm just going to go down here. I'm going to select my redshift ROP, and I want to see if possibly adding any global illumination makes this look slightly less like garbage. Not much. I think that maybe, let me see here. I think that maybe maybe the noise has got just a little bit too much on the roughness. So I'm just going to dial that back a little bit. And, you know, modifying roughness in cops isn't really going to do too much here until you hit the refresh button. I found that modifying cop nodes generally tends to keep things. It doesn't really have an effect in the IPR. You have to sort of manually refresh it. So I'm just going to go back into my image context. Maybe I'll do a little bit more blurring just to get something a little bit more, I don't know, just to see what we can do. I'm just going to increase the blur size to 100, and I'll throw another refresh out there to see what we got. You know, we get some sort of, it's almost like we've built like a rock wall type of another rock wall generator, but this time it's more of a shader, I guess. So that's cool. You know, at this point, I think what might be important to know how to do is to actually render out these image sequences from this CopNet, because like I said before, we could even be doing like compositing operations where we're bringing in image sequences and compositing them together, doing some simple masking and stuff like that, color correction, anything. You can add depth of field, keying, all sorts of stuff. Maybe we just take a look real quick at, you know, because we've got this compositing network and it is live calculating all of this stuff. Ultimately, it's going to be easier. It's going to make rendering go faster if you do kick these out as an image sequence and then load them back in as textures. So I'll just quickly kind of show you how we can output images from the COP network. So I'm going to just stop the render here, and let's just pretend we want to save out this image sequence that we were creating here in our composite view. I can just throw down a ROP. So ROP file output, I'm just going to throw it down here and wire in our last node like so. And here it's, you know, like any of our other render nodes, we can just set what frame range we want. I'll just do 24 frames for our purposes, and I can set my file name here. It looks like it's by default set to EXR. I'm just going to change it to JPEG to, I don't know, just for the sake of changing the file type. No reason really. I'm just going to pull up my, project file. And I've got my render folder here. I got my lesson 6, which is my hip, and then /render/ all this stuff. So now that I've created this ROP comp output node, I can just hit render. And if I switch back over here, you can see it's rendering out my image sequence like so. And in no time at all, we will have our own little image sequence. Let's see if, yeah, that's the histogram still. Okay, cool. So now switching back to Windows, you can see that there is, we've got our image kicked out, and we could bring it into another program if we wanted to, or we could load it right back into Houdini. So that is just sort of a little brief intro to COPS. The possibilities are basically endless in this regard. I mean, I've seen lately especially some very insanely cool things done using this type of technique. It's totally powerful. So I hope that was informative and interesting. And in the next section, we're just going to cover a couple more housekeeping items about workflow. And I'm just going to get you guys all sort of introduced into a couple workflow concepts as it pertains to getting Geo out of Houdini and getting Geo into Houdini, so that when we go into our simulation section, we can worry about all the various ways we can export our geometry into another application like Cinema 4D for rendering. So stay tuned for that. I hope you had fun, and we're going to get to the dynamics soon. We've only got like one more lesson until we get in there. So hang in there, and I'll see you in the next lesson.